You're under arrest for conspiracy, breaking and entering, and attempted destruction of property. Those were the glorious words the sheriff's deputy said to my HOA president, Brenda, as she stood there in her silk pajamas at 3 in the morning. I'm a retired canine handler, and my lake cabin is my sanctuary. So when this power-tripping woman decided my cabin was an eyesore and tried to send a demo crew in the middle of the night to tear it down, she made a big mistake. She thought I was ignoring her ridiculous fines. What she didn't know was I was documenting everything, and that my 2 dogs were waiting for her little welcoming party. This story is absolutely insane. You're not going to want to miss a second of it. Drop a comment and let me know what state you're watching from. It all started the way these things always do, with a ridiculously small issue that spiraled into suburban warfare. I'd bought the lake cabin about 5 years before this whole mess began. It wasn't in an HOA at the time, just a quiet little collection of rustic cabins on a beautiful, pristine lake tucked away in the mountains. I'm a retired canine officer, spent 20 years with the state police unit, and my partner, a Belgian Malinois named Zeus, had just retired with me. My second dog, Hades, a younger Dutch Shepherd, was a rescue I was training for search and rescue operations. For me, the cabin was more than just a property. It was a promise. A promise of peace, of quiet mornings on the water, of a place to decompress from a career spent dealing with the absolute worst of humanity. The cabin itself was old, built in the 1960s, solid cedar and stone. It had character, which is realtor speak for needs a lot of work. I'd spent those first few years lovingly restoring it, keeping its rustic charm while updating the essentials. New wiring, new plumbing, a new roof, the works. I did everything myself. It was my project, my therapy. The trouble began when the lakeside community, which had grown significantly since I first arrived, voted to form a homeowners association. I wasn't thrilled, but I understood the logic. Some of the newer, multi-million-dollar McMansions that had popped up wanted to ensure property values stayed high. I voted against it, but the motion passed. For the first year, it was fine. The fees were reasonable, and the rules were mostly common sense stuff about keeping the public docks clean and not leaving trash out to attract bears. Then, Brenda was elected president. Brenda was a new resident. She and her husband, a perpetually startled-looking man named Gary, had built one of the largest houses on the lake, a gaudy monstrosity of glass and steel that looked more like a corporate headquarters than a cabin. She drove a pristine white Range Rover and always wore immaculate, expensive-looking athletic wear, despite the fact I'd never seen her do anything more strenuous than wave a finger disapprovingly. From the moment she took the helm, the HOA became her personal fiefdom. The friendly monthly newsletters were replaced by weekly email blasts filled with passive-aggressive reminders and thinly veiled threats. The subject lines were always in all caps: urgent, trash can violations, or immediate attention, unapproved decorative items. My first run-in with Brenda was over a bird feeder. It was a simple cedar feeder I'd built myself, a smaller version of the cabin's design. I hung it from a sturdy oak branch in my front yard. 2 days later, I received an email with a grainy, zoomed-in photo of the bird feeder attached. The email, from Brenda, informed me that all exterior additions must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for approval. There was no committee, of course. It was just her. I replied politely, pointing out that the feeder was not a permanent structure and that the bylaws said nothing about items of that nature. Her response was immediate and frosty. Mr. Peterson, the bylaws state that I, as president, have the authority to interpret the rules for the betterment and aesthetic harmony of the community. The feeder is not harmonious. Remove it. I knew it was absurd, but for the sake of peace, I took it down. It was a mistake. It showed her she could push me. A week later, it was my woodpile. I keep a neatly stacked cord of wood along the side of the cabin for my wood-burning stove. It was covered with a brown tarp, tight and secure. I received another email, this time with a fine for $50. The violation? Improper storage of materials. According to Brenda's new, unilaterally decided interpretation of the rules, all firewood had to be stored in an approved, prefabricated shed that matched the color scheme of one's primary residence. Again I pushed back, this time with a printed copy of the bylaws that clearly stated firewood piles were permitted as long as they were neat and didn't attract pests. I left it in her mailbox. The next day, the copy was back in my mailbox with a single sentence scrawled across it in red marker. Second notice. Fine is now $100. I was starting to see the pattern. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. Brenda was a bored, wealthy woman who had found a new hobby, playing Queen of the Lake. And my quiet, rustic, and distinctly un-McMansion cabin was a blight on her perfect kingdom. She particularly seemed to despise my dogs. Even though Zeus and Hades were impeccably trained and never barked unless given a command, she would complain about them. I'd get notices about excessive noise, which was impossible, or intimidating animals, despite them never leaving my property without a leash. She was building a case, brick by brick, violation by violation. I knew this wasn't going to end with a fine for firewood. This was just the opening salvo. I decided then that I would not engage with her directly anymore. Arguing was pointless. She was immune to logic. My response would have to be methodical and built on a foundation she couldn't argue with: the law and her own rulebook. I went through the HOA bylaws with a fine-tooth comb. I highlighted every ambiguous phrase she was exploiting, every clause that gave her discretionary power. I then cross-referenced them with state and local property laws. I have a good friend, Dave, who is a real estate lawyer. I sent him the documents and we had a long call. He confirmed my suspicions. Brenda was overreaching, massively. Her interpretations wouldn't hold up to any real scrutiny. He told me to stop paying the fines immediately. Don't acknowledge them, he said. Don't argue them. Just let her send the notices. Let her build a paper trail of her own absurdity. We'll let her hang herself with it. It was sound advice. So, I started a new file. I labeled it Brenda. Every email, every notice, every red marker scrawled threat went into that file. I set up a new security camera, a discreet one pointed directly at my front yard and the street. I wanted a record of any time she or her husband, who she often dispatched as her little henchman, came onto my property to take their grainy photos. My cabin was my sanctuary, and I was beginning to feel like it was under siege. The peace I'd come here to find was being systematically dismantled by this petty tyrant in yoga pants. But I wasn't going to back down. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw an old cop in a rustic cabin. She didn't see the years of training, the patience for long-term surveillance, the unwavering resolve to see a fight through to its just conclusion. She wanted a war over aesthetics. She was about to find herself in a battle of strategy and evidence, and that was a fight she was woefully unprepared for. The next phase of Brenda's campaign of harassment began subtly. The fines kept coming, escalating with each unpaid notice. The firewood fine was now apparently at $500. A new one appeared for unapproved landscaping, because a patch of native wildflowers I'd cultivated near my porch didn't fit her vision of manicured lawns. That one started at $100 and quickly quadrupled. Then came the violation for my truck. I drive a 10-year-old Ford F-Zero 50. It's clean, well-maintained, but it's a work truck. It has a few scratches, a small dent in the rear bumper from a rogue fence post. According to Brenda, it was a commercial vehicle and couldn't be parked in my own driveway. I received a notice demanding I park it in my garage. The problem was, my garage was my workshop. It was full of tools and lumber for my never-ending cabin projects. The truck wouldn't fit. I ignored the notice, and the fines started rolling in. Each notice was more unhinged than the last. She started adding late fees, administrative fees, and something she called an aesthetic non-compliance penalty. My file folder was getting thick. The emails became more frequent, almost daily. She was CCing the entire HOA board on them now, a group of mostly older, retired folks who seemed content to let Brenda run the show as long as it didn't interfere with their tea times. They were classic enablers, either too timid or too apathetic to question her authority. I realized I needed more than just a file of her ridiculous notices. I needed to understand the machine she was operating. I requested a full copy of the HOA's financial records, which was my right as a homeowner. At first, she refused, claiming they were confidential. I had my lawyer, Dave, draft a formal letter citing the relevant state statute, and a week later, a thick binder landed on my doorstep with a thud. I spent the next 2 weekends with a pot of coffee, a yellow legal pad, and that binder. I'm no accountant, but in my line of work, you learn how to follow the money. It didn't take long to find the irregularities. The HOA had a surprisingly large budget for landscaping and beautification, yet the only beautification I'd seen was the new, elaborate floral arrangement at the front gate, right next to a large, new sign that read, Lakeview Estates, Brenda Miller President. I cross-referenced the landscaping payments with the company listed on the invoices. It was a company called Lushscapes LLC. A quick search of state business records showed that Lushscapes LLC was registered just 6 months prior. The registered agent? Gary Miller, Brenda's perpetually startled husband. He had listed the business address as their own home. She was funneling HOA dues directly into her own pocket, disguised as a legitimate business expense. This was more than just a petty abuse of power. This was fraud. Armed with this new information, I knew I had to play the long game. Exposing her now would feel good, but it would be my word against hers. She'd claim it was a legitimate business and that her husband was giving the HOA a great deal. I needed something more definitive, something undeniable. I continued my quiet defiance. I didn't remove the wildflowers. I didn't park my truck in the garage. I didn't pay a single dime of her fabricated fines. Her frustration was palpable. The tone of her emails shifted from passive-aggressive to overtly hostile. She started writing things like, "Your continued refusal to comply is damaging the community and will be met with the severest possible consequences." In one particularly unhinged message, she called my cabin a rotting disgrace and a monument to nonconformity. I saved every word. It was during this period that I got a visit from one of my neighbors, an older gentleman named Arthur. He was one of the original cabin owners, a retired history professor. He shuffled up my driveway one afternoon, looking over his shoulder as if expecting an ambush. "I'm not supposed to be talking to you," he whispered, gesturing vaguely in the direction of Brenda's glass palace. "She's told the board you're a problem resident and that we're not to engage." Arthur told me that Brenda had been holding special, informal board meetings about me. He wasn't on the board, but his friend was, and he was deeply concerned. "She's obsessed, son," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "She's talking about putting a lien on your property. She's even mentioned foreclosure for a woodpile. It's madness." He then told me something that made my blood run cold. She was asking about forcible remedies. Asking what the HOA's rights were if a homeowner refused to remedy a violation that was actively harming property values. Forcible remedies. The phrase hung in the air between us. This was a significant escalation. She wasn't just thinking about paper warfare anymore. She was getting desperate. The fines weren't working. The social pressure wasn't working. She was losing control of the narrative she'd created, where she was the valiant defender of community standards, and I was the lawless outlier. A lien was one thing. I could fight that in court easily with the evidence I had. But forcible remedies? That sounded like she was planning to take matters into her own hands. That was the night I upgraded my security system. I already had the one camera on the front, but I went into town and bought a full, professional-grade, multi-camera DVR system. I installed high-resolution night vision cameras covering every angle of my property. One was aimed directly at my front door and porch, another down the driveway, one covering each side of the cabin, and a final one overlooking the back deck and the lake. I wired them to a secure server and a backup cloud service. The system had motion detection and would send instant alerts to my phone. I wasn't just preparing for Brenda anymore. I was preparing for what a cornered, irrational person might do. The final part of my defensive strategy was already in place. Zeus and Hades. To Brenda and the other residents, they were just dogs. But I knew what they were capable of. Zeus was my former partner, a seasoned police K9, trained in apprehension and handler protection. His bite was a last resort, but his presence alone was an overwhelming deterrent. Hades, while younger, was fiercely protective and incredibly intelligent. They were both trained to respond to specific, quiet commands. A calm, "Watch him," would have them at full silent attention. A whispered, "Stand by," would have them poised for action. A sharp, "Hit," was the command for controlled apprehension. It was a command I hadn't used since my last day on the force, and prayed I'd never have to use again. But Brenda was pushing things into uncharted territory. My cabin was no longer just a home. It was a fortress. And the Queen of the Lake was about to lay siege. She had no idea the reception I had planned. The final warning shot came in the form of a certified letter. It was a thick envelope, oozing self-importance. Inside was a document, professionally printed on heavy cardstock, titled, "Final Demand for Compliance, Notice of Intent to Remedy." It was a masterpiece of amateur legal threats. It listed every single one of my violations, from the bird feeder months ago to the current state of my truck. The total in fines and penalties had reached the astronomical sum of $7,850. The letter stated that I had 72 hours to pay the full amount and rectify all outstanding violations. If I failed to do so, the letter continued, the HOA would exercise its right under Article 9, Section 4 of the bylaws, to enter the property to remedy the violations at the homeowner's expense. It was the forcible remedy Arthur had warned me about. The cost of this remedy, it cheerfully noted, would be added to my account, along with any legal and administrative fees. I immediately scanned the letter and sent it to Dave. His response was a single line of text. "This is a gift. She has no right to enter your property, let alone demolish anything. She's citing a clause about mowing an unkempt lawn, not tearing down a structure. Let her." I knew what was coming. Brenda wasn't the type to bluff and then back down gracefully. Her ego was too deeply invested. She was going to try something monumentally stupid. For the next 72 hours, I was on high alert. My phone was always in my pocket, alerts on. Zeus and Hades could sense my tension. They stuck closer to me than usual, their ears twitching at every sound, their eyes following my every move. They were the perfect early warning system. I slept lightly, my ears tuned to the night's quiet symphony lapping of the lake, the cry of a loon, the rustle of leaves. The third night, just after 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. A motion alert. Driveway camera. I rolled out of bed, my heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm. I tapped the screen, and the live feed filled my vision. A large, unmarked panel truck was slowly, silently, rolling down my driveway with its lights off. It stopped about 30 yards from the cabin. The passenger door opened, and a man got out. He was thick-set, wearing dark clothes and a ski mask. Then another man got out of the driver's side, similarly dressed. They walked to the back of the truck and opened the doors. They pulled out crowbars, a sledgehammer, and a gas-powered demolition saw. This was it. This was her remedy. I moved silently through my dark cabin. Zeus and Hades were already awake, standing at attention by the door, not making a sound. They looked at me, awaiting a command. Their discipline was absolute. I gave them both a quiet pat. "Watch him," I whispered. Their focus shifted instantly to the front door, their bodies coiled like springs. I went to my office and pulled up the live feeds on my large monitor. Camera 1. 2 men creeping toward my front porch. Camera 2. The panel truck, with a third man now visible in the driver's seat. Camera 3 and 4, covering the sides of the house, were clear. They were focused on a frontal assault. One of the men on the porch raised his crowbar and wedged it into the frame of my front door. It was a solid oak door, I'd reinforced myself. The man put his weight into it, and the wood groaned in protest but held firm. The second man joined him, and together they began to pry at it. My blood was ice. This was happening. This woman had actually hired criminals to break into my home and destroy it. I picked up my phone. My first call wasn't to 911, it was to the county sheriff himself. We weren't friends, but we knew each other from my time on the force. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Sheriff, it's Peterson," I said, my voice low and calm. "I have a break-in in progress at my lake cabin. Multiple hostiles, armed with demolition tools. I have them on live video." I gave him the address. "I have 2 trained K9s inside with me. They are on standby. I am not armed, but my dogs will defend me if the hostiles breach the door." "Understood, Peterson," he said, his voice now sharp and clear. "Patrol cars are rolling. Do not engage. Keep the dogs on a leash if you can." "They're not leash trained for this, Sheriff," I said. "They're trained for this exact scenario. They won't leave the property. They'll contain the threat until your men arrive." There was a brief pause. "All right. Keep the line open." The men at the door were getting frustrated. They gave up on the door frame and turned their attention to the large picture window next to it. One of them raised the sledgehammer. This was my trigger point. Destruction of property was one thing. A breach of the interior was another. That's where my dogs and I were. "Sheriff, they're about to breach the window," I said calmly into the phone. "I'm deploying my dogs." I walked back to the front door. Zeus and Hades were trembling with contained energy, their eyes locked on the sound of the men outside. The first strike of the sledgehammer against the reinforced glass sounded like a gunshot in the pre-dawn quiet. The glass spiderwebbed, but didn't break. The second strike, however, shattered it, sending shards tinkling onto my porch and my hardwood floor. "Hades," I said, my voice even. "Hit." Hades shot through the now open window frame like a black and tan missile. He was a blur of focused fury. I heard a scream of pure terror, a crash as a man fell backward off my porch, and then the sound of Hades' warning growls, deep, guttural, and utterly terrifying. He wasn't biting. He was hurting. He had the first man pinned to the ground, circling him, barking with an intensity that would freeze the soul of the bravest man. The second man, who had been holding the sledgehammer, stood frozen for a second, his ski mask unable to hide his panic. He dropped the hammer and turned to run. "Zeus," I said, opening the now useless front door. "Get him!" Zeus didn't bark. He was silent. He moved with a speed and grace that belied his age, a dark shadow flowing across the lawn. He didn't take the man down. He simply outran him, circling around in front of him and blocking his path back to the truck. Zeus stood his ground, teeth bared, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The man skidded to a halt, hands up, and started backing away slowly. Both men were now effectively neutralized, held captive by 2 very well-trained dogs, without a single bite mark on them. On my monitor, I could see the third man in the truck, his eyes wide, frantically trying to put the vehicle in reverse. He wasn't going anywhere. From down the road, I could see the flashing blue and red lights. The cavalry had arrived. The sheriff's deputies arrived in a force I hadn't expected. 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt, blocking the panel truck in. Sheriff Miller himself, no relation to Brenda, thankfully was in the lead car. The deputies swarmed out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. "On the ground! Hands where I can see them!" The 2 men from the porch complied instantly, seeming almost relieved to be dealing with humans instead of my dogs. I called Zeus and Hades back to me with a sharp whistle. They immediately broke off their engagement and trotted back to my side, sitting perfectly, their tongues lolling out as if it were all just a fun game. The deputies cuffed the 3 men, who were now shivering, not from the cold, but from pure, adrenaline-fueled fear. Sheriff Miller walked up my driveway, his face a mask of grim professionalism. "Peterson," he said, nodding, "you said you had them on video?" I invited him inside and led him to my office. I swiveled the monitor around and rewound the footage. I played it all. The truck arriving without lights, the men in ski masks, them pulling out the tools, the attempted break-in, the sledgehammer, and the flawless deployment of my K9s. The sheriff watched, his jaw tightening. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "They were really going to tear your place apart." He turned to one of his deputies. "Get their statements. I want to know who hired them." It didn't take much persuasion. The guy who'd been pinned by Hades was practically babbling. "It was the lady," he blurted out. "The HOA lady, Brenda. She paid us cash. Half up front, half when we sent her a picture of the cabin demolished. He said she'd given them my address and told them the cabin was abandoned and scheduled for demolition by the county. She'd assured them it was all legal, a forced abatement, and that no one would be home. She just wanted it done quietly, in the middle of the night, to avoid bothering the neighbors." This was the smoking gun. This was the direct link. It wasn't just HOA overreach anymore. This was a criminal conspiracy. "Sheriff," I said, turning up the volume on the video footage. The microphones on my cameras were sensitive. You could clearly hear the man with the sledgehammer talking to his partner right before he shattered my window. "You sure about this, man? This feels wrong." And the other man's reply, "She said it's fine. $5,000 for a couple hours' work. Just knock it down." The sheriff looked at me. "I think it's time we paid a visit to Miss Miller. He told me to stay put, and that a deputy would remain with me to take my full statement and document the damage." 2 of the patrol cars, with the cuffed demolition crew in the back, left. The sheriff's car, however, didn't head back toward town. It turned the other way, deeper into the Lakeview estates, toward the monstrosity of glass and steel at the end of the point. The next 30 minutes were a blur of activity. The remaining deputy was a young, sharp kid who meticulously photographed everything: the broken window, the pry marks on the door, the tools left on my lawn, even the paw prints my dogs had left in the soft earth. I gave him a complete, detailed statement, walking him through the months of harassment, the bogus fines, the financial records I'd uncovered, showing her husband's sham landscaping company. I printed out the entire Brenda file for him, every email, every notice, every threatening letter. The deputy's eyes got wider with each page he read. "Sir," he said, shaking his head, "this is one for the books." Just as he was finishing up, his radio crackled to life. It was the sheriff's voice. "We have the suspect in custody. Female. Name of Brenda Miller. We're bringing her in." I couldn't stop the grin that spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of profound, bone-deep satisfaction. The deputy gave me a knowing look. "Sounds like your problem is being resolved, sir." The fallout was swift and spectacular. Brenda, confronted by the sheriff at 3:30 a.m. in her silk pajamas, had initially tried to bluster her way out of it. She denied everything, claiming I was a disgruntled homeowner trying to frame her. Her whole story fell apart, however, when the sheriff informed her that the 3 men she'd hired had already confessed and that their entire conversation implicating her was on high-definition audio. Her husband, Gary, apparently just stood there looking startled, which seemed to be his default state. Brenda was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit breaking and entering, attempted destruction of property, and several other felonies. The story hit the local news like a bombshell. HOA President arrested in bizarre 3 a.m. demolition plot. My quiet lake community was suddenly infamous. My phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months called to offer their support. Arthur, the retired professor, was ecstatic. "I knew it. I knew she was a nutcase." He crowed over the phone. "The whole board has called an emergency meeting. They're demanding her immediate resignation." That emergency meeting, which I attended, was a sight to behold. The enablers on the board, who had blindly followed Brenda's lead, were now pale and terrified. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. The other homeowners, many of whom had also been victims of Brenda's petty tyranny on a smaller scale, were furious. I stood up and laid out the whole story, presenting copies of the financial records I'd uncovered. The revelation that Brenda and Gary had been embezzling HOA funds through their fake landscaping company was the final nail in the coffin. The entire board resigned in disgrace that night. An interim board was appointed, with Arthur as the acting president. The first official act of the new board was to void every single fine and violation notice Brenda had ever issued to anyone. My $7,850 debt vanished into thin air. They also passed a motion to formally dissolve the Architectural Review Committee stating that aesthetic choices were a matter of personal taste, not HOA regulation. The community felt like it could breathe again. The reign of terror was over. Brenda's legal troubles were just beginning. She hired a high-priced lawyer from the city who tried to paint her as a dedicated community leader who had simply been overzealous. That defense crumbled in court. The video and audio evidence was irrefutable. The testimony from the demolition crew, who got a plea deal in exchange for their cooperation, was devastating. Her husband, Gary, was also charged in the embezzlement scheme. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the prospect of a long prison sentence, Brenda took a plea deal as well. She was convicted of multiple felonies, sentenced to 3 years in prison, and ordered to pay restitution not just to me for the damages to my cabin, but to the HOA for every dollar she had embezzled. Their glass house on the lake went up for sale to cover their legal fees and the restitution. I heard it was bought by a nice family from California with 3 noisy, happy kids. They put up a basketball hoop in the driveway. No one complained. My cabin is my sanctuary again. Zeus and Hades are back to their normal routine of sleeping in sunbeams and chasing squirrels in their dreams. The community has healed. We have reasonable bylaws now, a friendly board, and a renewed sense of camaraderie. People wave when they drive by my old truck. Someone even left a new handmade bird feeder on my porch with a note that just said, "Thank you." Sometimes, peace and quiet aren't just found, they have to be fought for. And sometimes, the best way to deal with a bully isn't to argue, but to patiently gather your evidence, set your defenses, and let them walk right into a trap of their own making. Brenda thought my cabin was an eyesore. Now, every time she looks in the mirror in her prison cell, she'll see the face of a woman who tried to destroy a man's home and ended up demolishing her own life instead. And that, to me, is the very definition of aesthetic harmony.